Good morning, everyone. It works this time. Fantastic. That's the third time I've said good morning. Yeah, full house. This is very cool. So thank you very much for coming along this morning. I'm sure many of you have sore heads from Alicia Keys last night. So my voice actually isn't from the gig, but just 3 days of speaking to people has taken its toll. So you have to bear with me. So what we're here to talk about this morning is a practical guide to Git-based development. I'll get the obligatory intro out of the way as to who I am. So I'm the CEO of a company in the UK, and we make a Salesforce release management solution. So for the last 2.5 years, I've really been pushing Git heavily to all of our customers and coming to places like Dreamforce and user groups and talking about it as much as I can. So I'm really excited to see that at this Dreamforce in particular, Git seems to have been, and Git and release management seems to be the topic that is finally getting some really great attention, and we've all got Salesforce DX to thank for that. Just as a quick show of hands, who is currently source controlling their metadata? Okay, cool, so about half. And who's yet to start? Okay, cool. We can probably go through the intro to this thing quite quickly. So I want to talk, for those of you that don't know, sort of what is version control? So not applied to Salesforce, but just generally, what is it? So at its most fundamental, version control is tracking changes to files. So it sounds very simple, and it is very simple. Ideally, those files will be simple, easy to read text files, and then the version control system will track the deltas to them. That's when version control really works at its best. So if you've got binary assets like images, you don't get the same advantages. Simple, easy to read text files, that's what we're going for. And why might you want to do that? It provides a brilliant way to give feedback on the work that you're doing. So with version control systems, you're choosing deliberate snapshots, you're choosing deliberate points in time that you're going to be saying, this is a version of this work. I get to assign a comment to it and give a little bit of the thought process that went into producing that change. It gives you a backup, so you've always got that security that you know where things are. And as I mentioned, we want these files to be human readable, easy to modify, but once they're in a source control system, then they're also machine readable, which is great because then we can do lots of automation, orchestration, and trigger different events based on what's happening in the source control system. So what are some of the benefits that you'll get if you adopt source control? So the thing that really is key to all of this is this idea of a single source of truth. So that gets talked about a lot about now, and what it just says is that the source control system is the one place that you can go to get the view of the world and what it should look like. So whatever your profile setup is inside Git, that's what your profiles should look like. And if they're not like that, then there's a kink in your process somewhere, and you need to make it, rectify that. It enables parallel development streams, and it does it safely. So if you can do parallel development, lots of different ways if you like, you can use sandboxes and move changes around, but the source control system and version control systems were designed to allow people to create branches, work in isolation, and then flag up things like conflicts and help you resolve those. They also give you a full audit trail, so they'll obviously track the differences between files and the technical nature of the work that you're doing, how it's changing, but it also gives you more of an audit into the insight of what the admin or developer was thinking when they made that change. So with good commit comments, with good PR discussions, you can track a lot more than just what changed, and you get the why. The why, you no longer need to capture that in documents. It's all part of the history of the repository. That means that years later, if you come back to it, you'll understand, what you were thinking or what your colleague was thinking 2 years ago. Because you've got this single source of truth and you know exactly what everything should look like because that's what the source control system looks like, that means that you can deploy consistently across environments. So you don't need to worry anymore about sandboxes getting out of sync or people doing things ever so slightly different ways. If you embrace version control and say, this is what the world looks like, then you can deploy that set of metadata out to as many different environments as you like, and it will always be the same. again, that code review and peer review, generally PR discussions and getting an extra bit of scrutiny on your work just reduces bugs, makes things better. Even if it's not reducing bugs, which it almost certainly will, it gives us all a chance to improve. So when we've done the work, we have a discussion about it. You know, we get to attack it as a team and make sure that it's the best that we can do. Because you're recording the deltas of everything along the way, makes it really easy to roll back. So you can go back to any point in time, understand what your metadata looked like at that point, and move back to it. And so the big benefit for version control and adopting and embracing it really, you know, as more than just a backup, is that it helps you make releases faster, more confidently, and more reliably. So many of our customers have this kind of setup. And sort of go on a journey before they actually reach the need for version control. So very often people, when they adopt Salesforce for the first time, just use a production org. They all work together in a production org, and then eventually they start to trip over each other's toes. And there's some seats scattered around the middle here, by the way, if anyone wants to sit down. Yeah, so you're all working the production org, then you eventually start tripping over each other, and you know you've all the problems that comes with that. So you adopt a good sandbox strategy, and a lot of our customers would have this kind of setup. You have everyone working in either totally isolated developer sandboxes, or maybe you share them a little bit, you know, on a project basis or a group of people. But you know, you're living in the org. That's where you're doing all of your work. You then bring those things together, either using something like change sets or a third-party tool like Gearset, and you move all those changes into some central integration and testing environment. Again, that's an org, so you're starting to see you're having to track differences, and maybe I've done some experimentation in my org before I move it, and how you filter that out and make sure that you're moving just the things you want can become difficult. So that's typically the most difficult step, is getting it from the individual dev sandboxes into your integration environment. And once it's in there, then it should be hopefully straightforward once it goes through the test cycle, and you move it on to UAT and on to production. So if you fully embrace version control, you flip a lot of that on its head. So you know that this master branch, and we'll get into some of the terminology as we go through, but you've got a set of files, master, that are the source of truth. You know that if I want to start doing work, I don't need to think about which org to log into to start that work, because I can definitely just branch from master, because that's what the world should look like. Once I create a branch, I'll get an isolated view over those files. So now I can make changes safely. It won't impact my team yet. I can still track things. I can give things good commit comments. I can do my work in my org. I can go down little rabbit holes and Google around and find what it is I need to do to achieve the user story that I'm implementing, and then choose, you know, thoughtful times to snapshot that work, push it back to my feature branch, give it a good commit comment, and track that. Then at the end of my user story, at the end of that feature branch, I want to be able to merge that back into master, and that's the point that we'll start doing all that peer review. So we'll open a pull request, we'll say, you know, somebody else in the team, can you please scrutinize this work? And at that point, it's only ever the work, it's the smallest set of work that I've done that I want to merge back to the rest of my team. So if I have done any half-baked experiments or went down some wrong paths, they've all been discarded. They're left behind in my org, and I'll throw that away in a day or two. And the branch contains just the work that I wanted. So flips it on its head a little bit. I've gone through some of the benefits really quickly, just because so many of you were familiar with Git. And I guess the other platforms and other ecosystems have adopted version control for a very, very long time. So why is it relatively new to the Salesforce ecosystem? Why doesn't everyone always use version control? Why wasn't this the way historically? I think the biggest blocker has been what the Salesforce DX team refer to as externalizing the metadata. So everything that you change in the org ultimately affects the Salesforce metadata and how that's represented. Getting human readable or, you know, easy to work with text files that represent that work has historically been very difficult. Salesforce is a complex platform. Things like, you know, you get a nice UI to do a process builder, that gets translated into, you know, some pretty gnarly flows, and then that gets translated into XML. So you get just lost in translation as you go from each layer. And so that's been the biggest blocker. So with the metadata API and with Salesforce DX and those new set of APIs, that's changing. It's starting to become easier to externalize that metadata and get a good representation of more or less whatever you can do in an org. It's not quite there yet. There's still some stuff you can do in orgs that you can't represent, but it's more or less there. So once you've got the representation of the metadata actions as XML, as files, the next biggest thing has been around just exposure and making it accessible to everybody on the team. So there's almost certainly people in this room that are really comfortable with that kind of UI. You know, that's kind of where some of the guys in my team will live day to day. They're happy with CLIs. They're happy to learn about git push and rebase and all the fancy things you can do. But there's people that's intimidating for, and when you're trying to put together a process, you're putting together a process for the entire team, something that everybody can work with. And some of the Git tooling that's been designed historically around Java code or C# code or sort of more traditional platforms, they don't map terribly well to Salesforce. And then the final big thing that we hear when we speak to customers for the first time is around not knowing what good looks like. There's been countless books written and countless talks given on branching strategies and how you should arrange all of this stuff. And when people come to us, they often come with a little bit of trepidation and a little bit of nervousness about what you should set up and how they should set it up, and very often go down a path of trying to put in place a project to set this all up in a very complex way with multiple repositories and lots of gated branches and all of this kind of thing. So we actually think you shouldn't do any of that, and I'm going to sort of show a very, 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 very simple model. So we think sort of what I live by generally is you do the simplest possible thing until it doesn't work. Once you hit up against the limitations of it, then you start to bring in the extra complexity to address the needs. So don't start complex, start with a very, very simple model. The first thing you need to do when you adopt your version control is pick a system. There's lots of these, as you can probably tell from the talk title. Git's what I'm going to focus on, but it's the same thing more or less with all of them. They all work in slightly different ways, but it's the same core concepts. Subversion, Subversion's the longest that's been around. Lots of legacy entrenchment, and if your company has that, then you can start there, I guess. Mercurial was popular, but is less so now. And then there's commercial offerings like Perforce that solve, slightly more gnarly problems in interesting ways if you need them. But if you don't need any of that stuff, or if there's no reason to choose another option, then Git's a perfectly sensible default. Just start with Git. It's sort of what everyone uses now, works really well. There's no real reason not to use it unless you have a reason not to use it. So once you have adopted your source control of choice, the next thing to do is find somewhere to host it. So Git's just a technology. We need somewhere to actually put that code, what Git refers to as a repository, a server somewhere that we can use to collaborate. So these are the logos of a few of the bigger providers. On the left, you have GitHub. They're downstairs in the developer forest. They're really good. I think Salesforce actually just released a blog post where Salesforce devs can get 6 months free. I'm possibly misquoting something, but I'm pretty sure I read that last night, half asleep, where you can get 6 months free of GitHub for Business. And they have free public repositories in any case, so a good place to start if you're just setting things up. Atlassian are downstairs in the dev forest as well. They're really good. Their product's called Bitbucket. It integrates really well with Jira or Confluence. So if you're already an existing Atlassian customer, then that could be a great option. And the final little fox logo is GitLab, and it is a really good choice if you're either looking for something slightly more on a budget, if you need to run something on-premise for free, or if you just like their UI. But any of these options are generally good. The final decision you have to make just to get started is if you do it hosted or on-prem. So all of those options provide hosted products, so github.com, bitbucket.com, and gitlab.com. You can get set up in about 2 minutes. Or if you want to, if you've got compliance or regulatory needs, you can install those locally behind your firewall, put in a nice, secure, complex authentication scheme, but hosted is a perfectly good place to start unless you don't need to. So the model I'm going to talk about and go through today is this. This is actually what we follow for our business, for both our Salesforce deployments and for Gearset itself. So you'll notice this is a very simple model compared to some of the things that you might read. So it starts on the left-hand side with everybody working in isolation. That's key, that you have to have somewhere that you can work, that you can experiment and explore and make changes without impacting any of your colleagues. So traditionally this is done by spinning up a bunch of dev orgs, and now with DX going GA, you can just use scratch orgs for this. So if you think of someone like an admin, maybe just works directly in the org at all times, makes changes there to declarative fashion. You've got someone like a developer, maybe more of a hybrid approach where you do some things in the org and you do some things in the IDE, and you sort of iterate there yourself. The key thing is that they are isolated and they make changes, they only expose their changes to each other via the source control system. So everything flows through Git. So we would say that you should do everything on feature branches off master. Only have a single branch if you can. Again, there's sometimes reasons not to, but if you can have a single branch master that you branch from to create a feature branch for as short a time as possible, that's again key. You want to diverge away from the rest of your team for just as long as you need to. The really good thing is that this maps really well to lots of agile methodologies. So if you're using Kanban or Scrum or something, they would say very small user stories, a week, 2 weeks if you must, and then you can keep that feature branch there for that length of time, merge it back in, and at that point it's gone through a good level of scrutiny. You know, there's enough people on your team will have reviewed it, will have given you feedback on it, and it's now ready to go out. So before it goes anywhere, you want a continuous process. So this is the continuous integration bringing this in. But continuous integration, very lofty term, all it means is everything that goes into the source control system is integrated together. So I'll take developer A's changes, developer B's changes, and the administrator's changes. I'll mash them all together. I'll push them out to an org. Again, traditionally this was like a partial sandbox or something. Now you would use DX for this. I'll continuously integrate my master branch up to an org, run all the tests, run whatever scenario testing I've got, and verify it's correct. And I do that all the time. And that keeps master healthy. It keeps master stable. It means that at any point we can do a release to production because we trust master. We trust that it's a source of truth, and we trust that it's always valid. So that continuous integration is happening. We'll spot those bugs early as soon as they're happening. And then it's the same flow as before. You go to UAT, you go to production, only this time you're deploying something that's already been tested. So you're not recreating a change set from a previous org in the chain. You're just deploying something you've already deployed, so you know it's going to work. So if you follow this kind of model, by the time you come to do UAT deployments or you come to do production deployments, it should just work. The sort of fly in the ointment of all of this is in Salesforce, you have a bit of difference from sort of traditional platforms. Traditional platforms, you're always starting with the source code. You're always able to go through a source control system and ensure that it's always been reviewed before you release it into your org. But with Salesforce, a lot of the power from the platform comes in the flexibility of making quick changes. So they can either be fixes based on a previous deployment, or it can be a change that's come in from business. So we would say that's okay. You can bend the rules if you need to. Obviously depend on the size of your team, depend on your compliance requirements. But if you need to, make that change directly in production, just so long as you've got some way to bring it back into the source control system. So this is very much a rarity. You shouldn't do it often, but if you need to, just make sure you create that hotfix branch, put it through the same level of scrutiny that you would put any other change in your system, and then make sure it gets continuously integrated out to those lower environments. So you can skip production in this case, but you're keeping everything else in sync. So once you've got your version control in place and you've got a rough starting point of a branching strategy, the next thing to think about is what you want to version control. Again, it can be very tempting here to just start with absolutely everything. This is not like an exhaustive list. I wouldn't be taking too many screenshots of this. I don't know what that was, but so don't start with absolutely everything. Start with just like a subset. So the subset that matters to you is the one to go for. But we would sort of say, as a good starting point, start with your data model, so all of your custom objects. Start with your security model. Those are sort of the two most key things for a lot of people. So all your profiles, permission sets, they should ideally be source controlled. And then some of the programmability, so Apex and Visualforce are Lightning components. I'm really hoping another notification doesn't come up. Mac has assured me it's in presenter mode and there were no notifications, so that couldn't have happened. So you've picked the version control system, you've picked what to version control, and you'll see through all of this that I'm just saying simple, 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 unless you need to make it more complex. Okey-doke. So you've got something that works now. The important thing is to get something that works for the whole team. So the only other thing we see customers do sometimes is say, well, we'll have our developers work one way, and they'll use the command line, and they'll push things through Git, probably just Apex code, and some of the custom objects. And we'll have our admins work another way. And we would caution very, very strongly against that. You don't want division in the process. You don't want people to be in any way incentivized to sidestep the process. It should be something that brings benefits for the whole team. So put something in place, whatever it is, that works for the whole team. So at this point, I'm going to switch over to a demo. Okey-doke. So the demo I'm going to walk through, I'm going to start totally from scratch. So I'm going to create a new repository in GitHub. I'm going to seed that with, it's a random dev org, but I'm going to assume it's my production org. I'm going to seed that. And then I'm going to set up a CI job to make sure that it's all staying healthy. And then I'm going to make some changes in Salesforce. And instead of pushing those changes around orgs, I'm instead going to push them through the source control system and see how that model that I've just outlined works in practice. So obviously, being from Gearset, I'm going to use Gearset to do this work. The way you start with Gearset is you just go to gearset.com. Normally, there's a big old getting started button there. But since we're all out, we've got a banner saying that you can meet us downstairs in the dev forest. So I'm going to log in. You don't need to install anything in your org. You don't need to provision a demo environment or request access or anything. You just press login, and then you can log in with either your Salesforce credentials, developer production, Sandbox, Google, or LinkedIn. So I'm going to use Google because I've only got one of those, and I've got a million Salesforce orgs I need to remember the passwords for. And that takes you through to Gearset. So we have created a profile for you now. We've created just taken your email address and gotten some information, but we don't have any access to your org yet. So actually, before I do that, I'm going to jump over to GitHub and create a new repository that I can actually push this stuff to. So let's create a repository in GitHub. If you've never used GitHub, it takes about 5 minutes to sign up to. And then creating a repository, again, you can see here is a 30-second process. So I'm going to leave this one public, so you can grab it afterwards. And I've initialized it with a README, just to make it easy to add things to. So I've now got my repository. Back in Gearset, I'm going to seed that. So the first thing I would have to do if I was a brand new user is pick the Salesforce org that I want to use as the source of my seed, put in the username, press authorize, and that would then take you through the OAuth flow that would ultimately give us access to your metadata. That's a one-time thing, and I've got that saved, so let's choose the correct one. And then I'll say the target of this comparison is source control. And the source control repository that I want to do is not test, but is the one that I just created a second ago. Shout if you see it, because I don't. Let's refresh and see if that's there. There it is. Sorry? Oh, yep, we got it now. Okay, so As I said, we want to control what goes into GitHub as our starting point. We don't want to source control everything, so we can go through and pick the things that are important to us. I've actually done that before, so I've got what we consider to be a sort of a good starting point. So I'll just select that. And now I'll kick off the comparison. So what Gearset's going to do is go out to the org using the same Salesforce APIs that is used by change sets and DX, grab all of the metadata, so grab all of the things that I've asked it for, which from memory is custom objects, permissions, Apex classes. And then on the right-hand side, it's doing a git clone. So it's going to grab everything that's in my Git repository, which is currently empty, and then it's going to build up a comparison. So this is sort of the core UI of Gearset, where you can explore the differences between two sources of metadata. But as you can guess, because this is new, everything's new. So there's no changed items because GitHub's empty. There's no deletions. Everything's new. So I'm just going to select all of those, press next. Gearset's going to check the deployment. So later we'll see how this can grab things like missing dependencies. When you move to a version control system, I guess one of the benefits of change sets and Ant and these kinds of tools is you do actually get an error message. You do get told, hey, you're missing a field, you're missing a dependency. Whereas Git will always just accept them. So it's important that you have something in place that will capture that. So we're going to build up that final deployment package. We'll see what gets included. And then I will give a commit message. So this is my initial seed of the metadata. Rather than wait for it to finish, I'll just press deploy. And now Gearset's going to go ahead, build up that deployment package, and in a second or two, it will actually push it off to Git. So at no point have I had to do any Git operations. I haven't had to do any source controlling, like getting Git clones or Git commits or use any CLI. Instead, I'm able to just use simple UI that thinks in terms of Salesforce metadata. So in a second or two, if the Wi-Fi is good to me, then we will actually see that pushed up to GitHub. I practiced this 3 times this morning. It worked twice and didn't work once. So let's hope this is one of those times it works. So we'll come back to that in a second. It will actually, it will do its thing, and it will set that repository up with the initial metadata. In the meantime, I'm going to make a quick change to my org. So I'm going to modify a Picklist value, and I'm going to create a new field. So let's first of all create a new field. So I'm going to create a new custom field on the account object. So it's going to be a Picklist. Once you actually adopt source control, you can expect lots of people on your team to start arguing over their preferred Git client. That seems to take up a lot of time for my developers as they argue between the CLI, things like source tree or Gearset. There's lots of discussion about what the best way to use Git is. As I said, I wanted to show you what profiles look like in Git, so we'll just mess around with these a little bit, turn some things on and off. And then I don't want to add this field to any layouts. So I've created my new field, and then I'm going to modify one of the standard fields as well. So I'm going to go to the account source, and I'm going to add a new source, which is df17. So I've now made 2 changes. These are totally isolated, totally safe for me. And we can see that in the meantime, as I've been setting that up, Gearset's actually finished that push up to GitHub. And if I look in GitHub, I've now got an initial bunch of stuff in there that I can now branch from, I can track against. So before I do that, I want to set up a CI job so that now that I've got that in GitHub, I want to make sure it's always valid and that anything anyone on my team does, that if it kind of introduces an error, that we catch it early. So let's set up a CI job running from, GitHub and that repository that I just created a moment ago. The master branch, I want it not to run I want it to run to a CI org, and not to run every 4 hours, but instead run only when there's changes. So every time anybody changes anything in that master branch, I want Gearset to automatically pick up those changes, deploy them off to CI org. You could use a scratch org here, but we want to keep it around for more than those 7 days for testing for this particular scenario, and then make sure that it's always valid. And with the metadata filter, again, I just want to choose that same one as before. So press save. We've created the CI job, and the last job ahead of us is to set up a webhook. So what we want to happen is every time there's a change inside GitHub, we'd like GitHub to tell us about that, and then we can respond accordingly. So to do that, you just come to GitHub. Webhook stuff's all nicely built in. I just say exactly what it is. I've got my secrets so that I always know it's GitHub and not somebody else telling me to do things. And that's my webhook added. So you can see there it took almost like 2-3 minutes to create the repository, seed it, and set up a CI job, which will now run anytime that branch changes. So very, very simple to get going with. So I've made my change inside Salesforce. I've added some custom fields. I've modified that account source value. So now I want to deploy that, or I want to share that with my team in the source control system. So again, I've started my work in an org. That's cool. You can still work that way if you like to. I want to go to the source control system. Gearset's nicely remembered that it's this previous metadata repository that we're working in. But I don't want to use the master branch. So as I said, we want to do everything separate and isolated from the rest of my team until such time as I'm ready to share about it and make it a deliberate decision. So I can create a new branch. Picklist work. Create branch. Choose that same filter and kick off the comparison. So we're going to see that similar UI to what's happened before. On the left-hand side, we're getting all of the metadata from the org. What's different is on the right-hand side, that repository is not empty anymore. So we're going to do a clone, grab all the metadata that's in master, and then compare against it so we can see the changes that I've performed in Salesforce, how they're reflected against that metadata. So you can see I've made one change. I've modified this standard value set. You can see here I've added a Picklist value. It's on my dev environment. It's not in source control. And you get this nice UI over the top. This is what I was talking about, making it accessible to your whole team. So there's almost certainly people on your team that prefer this kind of thing. They want to see the XML. They want to see that and get that control over it. But others in your team, maybe less comfortable with that, would prefer to see this kind of rendering of it. So that looks good. Let's grab that. I've also created 2 new things. I've created this field. Yep, simple pick list, looks good. And then it's got some permissions. So we can see in a single glance what the profile impact has been of adding that field. So across all my profiles, I can see just the small snippet that refers to that field broken out. So let's grab that as well. Security model is obviously very important to source control. So Gearset's going to check that deployment, make sure that there's no missing dependencies. And now when the deployment package is built, we'll see all the other things that Gearset has included for us. So you can see there's modifications to all of our profiles. Those 3 clicks are going to affect a whole bunch of stuff. So this is adding the Picklist values. Kick off the deployment. So Gearset's going to take that delta, push it off to the source control system, create that new branch for us, and in a second or two, that will then appear very nicely for us in GitHub. Okay, great. So back over in GitHub, if I switch back to my files view, I can see here, yep, that branch has been created. So I can either go and explore it and compare it, or the next piece of the flow that you would follow is Polymer Quest, and this is this chance to do peer review, to have a discussion about what it is. So typically you would give this a good title, so sprint 2, Picklist user story. You'd have to forgive my terrible sample names, but this is adding a new account source value. And I can create the Polymer Quest. So now I can see exactly what's changed, the raw files, the deltas that have been created, new fields have been added, profiles have been changed. There's lots of stuff here that was hidden from us before because we were thinking in terms of the metadata, but now we get a chance to think in terms of the files as well. I can assign this to somebody else for review. So this is when you would start to get team leads, colleagues, peers to start to give you some critical feedback on your work. And then an assignee, someone that will ultimately merge this after the discussion. So typically when we create these feature branches, we keep them for about a week. We have lots of discussion around the PR, lots of people involved, and that just makes it better for everybody. So no one's shipping code that hasn't been through review. Now I'm going to merge this Polymer Quest. And that's been merged. So very, very simple. I have created a branch. I have done my work, as I always have, in the org, shared it with the rest of my team via the source control system via Git. Now that I've got this far, I can either delete that branch. That's the way we work on my team. We keep the PRs around as sort of the discussion point and why we did things the way we did them. Or you can leave that around for history as well. So I'll just delete that. And because that was a pull request from my feature branch back into master, if you recall the diagram, then that should have kicked off my CI flow. So if I switch back to my CI job, then yep, that's the one I created. You can see it's actually run. I can jump in. I can see, I got a nice green tick. I can dig into the reports and see exactly what was included in that run. But I'm confident that the changes I've made would work if I was to ship them to production now, and they can be shipped to production because they're on the master branch. So this is a complex topic. We've shown us a very simple model, but there's lots more to read about if you want to go to gearset.com/resources. My colleague Jason has written a really good white paper on how to arrange branching strategies, when to bring in complexity. So what I've shown simple, and not all of our customers can follow that level of simplicity. There's needs that drive it, and explores a little bit of that in the white paper as well. So it goes into more detail. I'd encourage you to download it. And it's very vendor agnostic. It just talks about the concepts as well. So a few conclusions. I'm sort of hoping that I've shown that it's got many benefits if you adopt version control, but adopt it more than just a backup. But like embrace it as a new way of working and a new way of collaborating. And the learning curve in the process will pay off for you. Start simple. If I've given you no other advice, is don't go complex early, because it won't pay off for you. And find a deployment tool. So whatever process you adopt, make sure your whole team adopts it. Don't incentivize people to stay outside the process. Don't make it difficult for people to adopt the process. Make sure that it works for your whole team, because you definitely don't want that schism, two different ways of working. Once you get everyone working together, the version control system becomes a really, really good way to collaborate. So that's me. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I think we're almost out of time according to this. So you can come up and chat to me afterwards, but thank you very much.